I hope you guys both had a really good week. Things are finally cooling down a little bit in St. George, which is pleasant, which means that last week the average was between 101 and 105 instead of between 108 and 118. I just, did I ever tell you guys that when I was a young kid, my dad, we grew up in the north end of the same desert. And my dad took us to a park one summer and we fried eggs on one of the metal slides. That's one of the reasons why they don't do the metal slides anymore, because they do get really hot. Of course, we didn't eat the egg, but we were able to fry one. I wanted to ask something, and I wanted to ask before we go on, and I totally forget about it. How do you guys take a lot of online classes with UVU and stuff?
It depends on the semester, but I'm the odd one that really likes online classes. There are some that I think are better in person for sure, but I like being able to pay stuff online. So anyway, yes, I take some online classes.
All right. How about you, Tanner?
Yeah, I also like as much as I can. I like to do online.
Okay. One of the ideas that people had to form community was to have everybody do a discussion where they put on a couple-minute video about themselves. And I think that works for normal people, but I don't know how that works for artists. What do you guys think? What's your take on that? I mean, if I had
I don't
required the
mind
first,
that idea.
you don't mind?
Like, yeah, what, just like posting like a little video where you tell about yourself or something? That's what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah. And put it on a discussion board so everybody can look at it.
Sure. I don't mind that. I don't know. I imagine people would look at some, but not all, which is totally cool. But yeah, I wouldn't mind doing that. I know I've done that for other classes.
Okay. How about you, Tanner?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what I'd talk about. It'd be short, but yeah, I'd do it.
Okay, because I'm wondering in the future about doing something like that. And that first week we were together, I had everybody talk a little bit about themselves. Maybe we could do that first week in a video so everybody can see it. And then the people that don't show up for that first meeting also get an opportunity to introduce themselves. And I thought that might be a good thing. Art people are really weird. I mean, I'm forced in an environment where I have to interact with normal folks, and it just is really, it's unsettling for me. And so it's good to hear your guys' take. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the final coming up too. Next week is the final, and every class, the department policy is we're required to give a final. And the block is a little bit different than regular. Because regular semester, we have specific times to give the final. And mine is not really a test. It's more like a reflection on the class for you guys. So if you could saw the module page, or if you have seen the module page, I put that up, and it's locked until Monday morning at midnight, I think. And then you can go on there. And what it is basically is between Monday and Friday at midnight, you have open that up. There's 4 questions, and each one requires a reflection response. And I give pretty specific directions about it. There aren't right or wrong answers. The grade comes from being able to articulate. I think that that's really important. As artists, we're not hired as professional writers because we're artists. That's why we're not writers, we're artists. But it is a really good practice to get into, to be able to articulate your thoughts. And that's one of the reasons why we have that whole critical thinking and tools of artistic critique, is to help you be more familiar and comfortable with the vocabulary which you can use to articulate some of the things that you notice about your own work and the work of other people. What's fascinating to me is when you speak slowly and clearly with those expensive words and throw them in, but you do it with a slight scowl so everybody can tell you're thinking really hard, you are taken so much more seriously. It's absurd. Have either of you read the Little Prince? There's been several movie versions of it too, but and even a couple musicals. Look that book up. It's called The Little Prince, and it's written by a French author. I can't remember their name, but there's a segment in it where it's basically a World War I pilot who gets lost in the North African desert, and he comes across a little boy who is very articulate and seems to be this kind of fantasy figure. And after he's rescued, he still is not convinced that that wasn't all a hallucination because of the things he learned. But one of the things that he talks about that specifically is a true event that happened. The person he was talking about was a Middle Eastern mathematician, but the same thing is true of Nikola Tesla and several others as well that we can see every once in a while. But when this mathematician was invited to present his findings at a prestigious European university, he was dressed in his native garb, and he came from Persia, and so he's wearing things that to the Europeans look like silk pajamas and a funny looking hat on his head, and nobody took him seriously. Well, he was pretty devastated, and one of his counselors said, well, you've got to dress in the same costume they're wearing, because otherwise they think you're a clown. So he came back dressed in European garb with the same suit and tie and the whole getup, and gave the exact same presentation, and the same audience was astounded at his brilliance. And Nikola Tesla, you guys have heard his name. He is arguably the most important, or one of the most important male physicists in the last 150 years. When he started over here in the US, nobody took him seriously because he spoke with an accent. And he had to work twice as hard to prove himself because of his accent, and people bullied and teased him. Which that's really awful and sad. But sometimes we have to be aware as artists that people expect a certain level of packaging, and they expect to be able to dismiss us quite readily because they think we're a bunch of ignorant hippies that do art because we can't do a real job. When you're able to talk about your own work intelligently and use words that you have gained from your university studies, people stop and look at you in a completely different way. And I'm totally serious. 90% of American adults have work with the 7th grade vocabulary. If you are able to use consistently your university vocabulary and talk about your work with intent, people automatically assume that you are more than just a regular artist. So, something to think about. So that final, that's going to be, it's not really difficult as long as you take the time to think about what you've done and you're able to articulate your thoughts. ChatGPT is not going to be a big help. I've actually received, I think I told you guys, I actually received essays as assignments from people that are supposed to be opinion essays. And in the middle of the essay, there's a little blurb that says, I am just an AI program, and as such, I have no opinions one way or another about art. And the thing that was so offensive to me was not that the person cheated, but that they didn't even bother to proofread the essay that they had the AI program write for them. That was just incredibly insulting. If you're going to cheat, at least make the. Do you guys have any questions about this stuff so far? All right. Now, have both of you folks done the applying the tools of artistic critique assignments? Critique your own
Yep.
work and critique somebody else's work. Okay, Kylie, you did. Tanner, you did too, didn't you?
I haven't yet. No, I was gonna do that this
Oh,
week.
you haven't? Okay, all right, good. I would recommend this next 2 weeks. These two things that we talk about today are not going to take an awful lot of time. They'll take brain power, but most of you will have spent a lot of time, more time on the textures and colors and all that kind of stuff. So I would like you to, if you can, this week, if at all possible, do that. And I'm not just singling you out, Tanner. I'm talking to everybody who listens to this absolutely astounding and riveting video. Do that artistic critique, those two assignments as soon as you can. We'll see you. And the reason for that is that you won't have to deal with it next week when you're doing assignments and final projects for all your other courses. And just look on the discussion board to the things that people have posted, because the ones that are up there and the ones that are coming in are looking really pretty good. I haven't been, it takes a little while sometimes for me to post those. One of the reasons is that I'm not always around high-speed internet. So it may take 2 hours for YouTube to finalize uploading something. But still, can you imagine how awful it would be if we still had dial-up modems? It would take forever. Are you guys old enough to know what a dial-up modem is? Okay, good. How was the texture and color assignment? Did you guys get anything? Did you guys enjoy that?
Sorry, I was thinking Tanner was gonna go. I really enjoyed it. I was expecting to enjoy the texture part more than the color, but then it ended up being the other way around for me. But it was fun all around.
All right, that's good. That's not really something that we think of all the time when we're working with sculpture, is it? We don't really think a lot about color.
Sure.
That's
Yeah. No.
I talked about Emperor Severus, North African emperor, that pretty much made England what it is. Everybody thought he was the stereotypical Roman emperor until people did discover that the micro flakes of paint on him and realized that he was North African. He was a black African emperor of the Roman Empire. And but we never think of that, do we? I think, and that's why I want you to spend the next week really working at revisiting what you've done and put as much color and texture in it. And after you're done, wait a while, go back and attack it again. It's more important that you try things out and stretch yourself, push yourself, do as much as you possibly can, and then a little bit more. Then do a little bit and say, "Oh, that's good." You've heard the phrase "less is more," haven't you? That is not the case for this. That is not the case for this assignment. All right, the next item on our agenda today is talking about contemporary processes and conceptual art. I wanted to, I think I'm going to go over the quiz really quick first, just kind of play with that a little bit. And then we're going to talk about some other things. Let's see, here we go. Doing the screen share. All right, you guys can see this, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now we're talking about contemporary processes, and this quiz, even if you've already done it, I want to go through this just a little bit really quickly. On these questions, these are all right out of the textbook. So basically, as briefly as possible, define the following 6 items from the reading. What is the difference between value and hue? What would you put for value?
So value is how light or dark something is. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
gray is a darker value and white is a lighter value, whereas hue is like a nameable color, and hue can have value in it.
Yeah, yeah, very good. This calls to mind for much of the relatively recent history of oil painting. We're talking about throughout the Renaissance. There were many artists that had, or many studios that had a hard time affording an awful lot of many of the colors, the pigments that were used in the oil paints. And so a lot of these paintings were primarily done grayscale with value, with the artist concentrating on the value. And then after they had that solidified, they would make what it sounds to thin veneers of pigmented paint and put that over the values. So value is very important. And this Roy G. Biv, I asked people one semester also to tell me if they could tell me how old he was, they could get extra credit. Do either of you know how old Roy G. Biv is?
No.
Since the rainbow is a manifestation of the electromagnetic spectrum, the theories on the age of the universe say that that was one of the first things that appeared. The electromagnetic spectrum was one of the first things that appeared in the birth of our universe. So Roy G. Biv is probably about 16, 17 billion years old. So not bad. And today we're going to be talking more about ready-mades and who pioneered them. And we're going to talk a little bit about found objects when we talk about ready-mades. And then through here, question 5, what each of these things, not all of them are used. Monochromatic, analogous, complementary, split complementary, triad, tetrad, and achromatic. Not all of them are used, and discord, but each of them are used only once in this question number 5. So I think that there's one more of these color schemes than there is questions in question number 5, or examples in question number 5, and you use each of them only once. So keep that in mind. And the computer will, if you misspell it, it will mark it as wrong, and then when I go back to grade it, I'll double check and get it taken care of for you. When we go through here, applied or natural color, those should be pretty much self-explanatory. So just do your best on that. And here we have one of my very favorite artists of all time, Betty Saar. I think she is absolutely amazing, and a pretty nice person too by herself. But she is profoundly incredible. Both of these people, John Chamberlain and Betty Saar, used found objects. Can either of you give me like a quick definition of what a found object is?
Just like materials you kind of like find around and then just like repurpose for your project.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is. And you see Betty Saar, she made kind of a collage with found objects, and John Chamberlain kind of soldered them together. And Betty Saar's is more of a shadow box, and John Chamberlain's is almost like an informal bouquet of flowers, kind of. So, but you can see they both use a similar process. They're both using what other people consider to be garbage, but you can see that they come to very different final products. And then I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about this piece. One thing I really like about Fran Crow is that she has a bit of a sense of humor. It's not, hitting each other with wet socks kind of sense of humor, but her sense of humor is there. It is present. I think it's a lot easier for people to appreciate her work because she doesn't take herself completely seriously. So And then we talk about the use of color in sculpture here. We have very different, these are almost the same sculpture, aren't they? Almost a mirror image. They're both an individual sitting on a bench. Just off the top of your head, do these two things feel different to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the primary difference is going to be the color of the figure. This one on the right, how does that feel to you? Is it that, and the one on the left, is this negative or positive? And is the one on the right negative or positive?
I'd say the left negative, right positive.
But it's just because of the color, isn't it? Because almost
Yeah.
everything else is identical. Yeah. So something to think about. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. And now I am going to talk about, so that's just a quick review of the quiz. Not anything terribly helpful, but enough to make you guys think about it. When we talk about contemporary process and conceptual art, there is confusion among these three terms: modern, postmodern, and contemporary. Contemporary means essentially what is going on right now, pretty much. And that usually covers basically the generation that is actively living right now and the time frame within that generation. So for us, the contemporary art may be from the 90s until now, and it may even go back a little bit farther than that. But that's what contemporary means, what's happening right now. Modern art is a little bit more, it's a little bit older, and it still floats into today. And then postmodern is a little bit more recent. It still floats into today. Modern art, I think we can say that it probably, most people identify it as starting end of the 19th century. So end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, right around Picasso and Marcel Duchamp. Those guys are pretty well considered like figureheads of modern art. And as we, or maybe not figureheads, but pioneers. And as we go into high modern art, we're talking probably like John Chamberlain's work, probably World War II, probably the 50s, right around there. And what is really fascinating to me is that a lot of modern art, people are very interested in materials use. They're very interested in shapes. They're very interested with how things fit together. But that interest in materials and how things fit and relate to each other is a lot more important than meaning. So you get something that looks like blocks of cement that are set up, but that's to get people to interact with the cement as a material and just kind of wonder about just the sheer form, and that's it. This is where we see, I think, a lot of Soviet brutalist architecture kind of fits into this, where it's designed to be dynamic, but not necessarily designed to promote an environment, so to speak, or to promote anything other than a very pragmatic worldview. Then we get into postmodern, where you see a lot of the same kinds of things. If you didn't have any context, you wouldn't be able to see an awful lot of difference, maybe. But what the big difference is that postmodern people start really thinking, what is the context? What is the meaning behind it? And so I think maybe a modern work would be somebody taking something and presenting it as a piece of art without changing it at all. And then a postmodern work would be somebody using those objects to make a new sculpture, to make you kind of think about what's going on. But there's a lot of bleed over. There's a lot of transition from one to another. I try really hard not to give specific dates as to when a movement or an idea begins and ends, because we're still impacted. I mean, right now, you guys look in almost any contemporary magazine or site that has advertising, there are going to be people that are heavily influenced by both modernists and postmodernists. You're going to get people that the postmodernists like Barbara Kruger, you're going to get that kind of impact in contemporary advertising, but you're also going to get some of the sensibilities that were introduced by the expressionists and people like Pablo Picasso, that kind of, or Cezanne. And so we're still kind of dealing with those kinds of things. And it's really hard to give an open and a close to any kind of movement unless we choose to define a movement as a group of people that self-identified with each other, working towards the same end. And it's, especially right now, you don't see that very much in the art world at all, unless people are going out of their way to make it happen. People really do. You do what you feel kind of drawn to do. My friend Brian Kershisnik talks about, as an artist, he feels something has to rupture inside of him. And when that rupture occurs, that's when the art comes out. And I think to carry that a little bit further, sometimes how that rupture is expressed depends on the visual language you feel is most appropriate at the moment. Because you guys are very aware at this huge history, huge record of art history, and you draw from that what you need to that feels the most appropriate. I think that's perfectly fine. That sounded like I really knew what I was saying, doesn't it? I'm really good at doing that. Okay. Let's see. We are going to do another share. This is one of my favorite artworks of the conceptual movement. So can you guys see this? It's let's see. It is this it's a YouTube video. I'm not going to play the YouTube video, but this is called Joseph Kosuth 1 and 3 Chairs. And this, we start moving into the conceptual idea. What is the difference between the art that you've been doing all along and something that is specifically labeled as conceptual art? Do you remember what we talked about last week? It has to do with the difference of, yeah, please.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think you mentioned that instead of like manipulating a material, although you may do that as well, the thing that you're trying to do is manipulate in like not a negative way, right? But manipulate concepts and kind of make people question things that way.
You're working directly with people's imagination and their thinking. That becomes your medium in conceptual art. And we can have a discussion about whether or not conceptual art is valid. But I want you to think about one thing is anytime we come across something and in our head we label it, oh, this is art, with a capital A or a lowercase a, it doesn't matter. At some point, on some level, whoever made that first has created a conceptual art, because we have a concept that immediately directs us to categorize what we see as art, as opposed to just a random thing. And I think we could argue that every time we create something, on some level, it's conceptual. When we look at Stone Age tools, when our ancestors created those tools, it's fascinating to me that the geometry that they worked with consistently for tens of thousands of years is identical to the geometry that the Greek potters worked with, or the Mayan ceramicists, or you can name any culture that produced beautiful ceramics and pottery. They're working with the same aesthetics as our ancestors were when they were chipping stone tools out of obsidian and chert. And I think that has to do with most of us, when we want to make something, we want to make something that we're happy with. And I think that kind of taps on the door of being conceptual. Now, as you look at this image of 1 and 3 chairs, what are some of the things that come out to you? Can you guys apply that first of the 4 tools of artistic critique and just tell me what you see? And I'll help. This right here on the right is the dictionary definition of chair.
Okay. What I see kind of in the center is a chair. It appears to be a wooden chair. And then off to the left, you have a black and white picture of what appears to be the same chair. It's placed kind of higher than the actual chair itself. And then in the top right, you have black words on a white sheet of paper with the definition of a chair.
All right, excellent. Now, Tanner, can you tell us what the 1 chair is and what the 3 chairs are?
Like the 1 chair, it's just kind of like it's all showing the same thing, but it's just interesting how it's like 3-dimensional, then 2-dimensional, and then like text, but it's all describing the same thing.
Yeah, that is excellent. That is absolutely perfectly exactly what I wanted to hear. Are you guys familiar with Plato's allegory of the cave?
Yeah.
Right. If you couple that with his idea of the realm of the ideal, have you ever heard of that term? The imaginal realm, or the realm of the ideal? Okay. The realm of the ideal is what Plato talked about as being somehow this world that exists in a different frequency or dimension from what we're used to. And in that is the penultimate form of each of the forms that we recognize here. And so in this realm of the ideal, there exists the ideal or perfect chair. And somehow our minds are connected to that realm of the ideal. And so when we see something that tells us it's a chair, it's because we remember on some level that the connection it has to the world of the ideals. Or that, so we don't come out with we don't develop the idea of a chair ourselves individually, but the concept of chair is more us remembering or connecting to that realm where the perfect chair exists. So, which is kind of weird to wrap your head around, but it kind of, I guess, sort of makes a little bit of sense, because when we look at this, like Tanner was saying, all 3 of these are chairs, but they're not all the same thing. And that's more kind of what the realm of the ideal is. Then we have a photograph of the chair, and neither of those are actually chairs, but they kind of sort of are. You can't use them, you can't sit on them, but they document what the chair is. And on one layer of understanding, they are every bit as real a chair as the 3rd chair, or that center chair, which we can actually use. And I think it's fascinating that Joseph Kosuth used his connection, his understanding of the realm of the ideal and Plato's allegory of the cave to kind of inform him as he put this together. Can either of you describe really quickly what the allegory of the cave is?
It's kind of just like, oh, it's been a while, back to high school. Let's see. It's like there's the whole thing with like the cast shadows telling a story, but how those shadows can deceive you from what it really is.
Okay. Yeah, and it's yeah, excellent. Imagine he says, imagine everybody are prisoners with their back chained so that their backs are to a fire, and all they see their entire life are the shadows, like Tanner was saying, cast onto the wall in front of them. And then he says, what if one of those prisoners somehow escapes his chains and goes outside and sees the actual world, and he sees all those things that were used to cast the shadows that he saw. And then he goes back into the cave to tell everybody what he sees, but they've only known a life with chains and shadows. Do you think they'd ever even believe him? And I think Plato even goes so far as to say maybe, a lot of those people may even want to kill him because he disrupts their comfort. I'm going to stop sharing that. Okay. And that, I think, really talks a little bit about what conceptual art is. Where the physical world, simply because of the fact that each of us are unique individuals and each of us have a slightly different perspective from everybody else. Even if you're a biological twin, even if you're a clone to somebody, there's no way that you can have the exact same perspective that they do, even if you're standing right next to each other. Everybody has a slightly skewed and unique perspective. But with conceptual art, instead of trying to show the physical world, we're trying to get at the ideas that are behind the physical world. And can you guys kind of see why I love that 1 in 3 chairs so much? Because it really deals with that idea beautifully well. And if you don't, you can nod anyway. Okay. Now I'm going to show one of the awesomest sculptures ever. If I can get this ad off. Okay, here we go. I was talking last week about this a little bit, and I've talked about this in my introduction to art classes too. What is this a picture of?
A urinal.
Yeah. Marcel Duchamp found it as he was walking one day. Somebody was remodeling an apartment, and this was in the rubbish heap. So he grabbed it, took it home, and I hope he cleaned it out. I don't know if he did, but he wrote that Armut 1917 on it, and then considering what we talked about with the galleries and how important they were in hopefully swaying public opinion, how do you think people responded to this?
Probably felt insulting to what they believed did.
Yeah, absolutely. It was an incredible insult. But some of the things that he was dealing with or addressing were the ideas of what makes art art. Is art only art when somebody else tells us, somebody who we assume has authority tells us it's art? What do you guys think?
Would you mind saying that again?
Is art only art when someone who we assume has authority to tell us so tells us it's art?
No.
No.
I feel like, I was just gonna say, it kind of feels like at least in like my line of work, I always hear people kind of talk about like imposter syndrome, but it's like what you're doing, it's like just as much art as maybe someone you look up to. Maybe it's not as good, maybe it's like different, but you're still doing art.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things Marcel Duchamp was addressing with this is the idea that perhaps it's okay to think for yourself and not only follow the opinions of somebody else that you feel are, a trend maker or creative or something like that. We get a lot of YouTubers now sway a lot of opinion. And what's sad is the reason why they sway opinion is not because they're more brilliant than anybody else or they're more articulate. A lot of the reason they sway opinion is because more people watch them than other people. And that's it. That's the only qualification. And I think it's pretty sad when so many of us give so much power to people who honestly really do not care that much. They don't have to live with the decisions that we've lived with all the time, but I think it's really disappointing when we so readily give so much of our power to think to other people. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the two main assignments for this week. Okay, actually, I'm not going to share the window on this. I'm just going to talk about it a little bit. One of the big assignments for this week, and I say big, going into this, since we're dealing with concepts, it's more important for you to pick something, present it, and articulate why it's valid than it is for you to spend a lot of time on it. A lot of the sculpture that I do, I present these little reliquaries with objects inside, and the object inside is as important as the reliquary, but I spent a lot of time putting the reliquary together. And a lot of the times the object is something that I found in a flea market or an antique store. So both of them together come up to make the art. But for this, what I need you to do for this first assignment, the ready-made, is to consider what Marcel Duchamp did. He's the pioneer or fairy godfather of basically modern art, the whole conceptual art movement, really, with this idea of the ready-made. And what he did was he found objects that other people created, repurposed them, recontextualized them, represented them, and called them ready-mades. And he only made, I think he made maybe a dozen of these his entire life. But each time he did it, pretty much, it really caused a stir because it forced people to think about things in a different way than they've been used to. So you're going to essentially find an object to use as a ready-made. And people before have done everything from a fork. They've used everything from a fork to one of those little teeny glass Christmas angels that you see with the gold halo. And it really doesn't matter what it is, but what I want you to do is look at that assignment and think how much something can change when you give it a different contextual context. And when you photograph it, a lot of people like to do, you go back to that first module when we talked about sculptural photography. And if you want to do sepia tones, make this look dramatic, black and white, fashion magazine type photography, think about all those kinds of things. How would this thing fit? Take this object, turn it upside down, present it in a different way, present it in a completely new way, give it a title, and then articulate the new context that you've provided for it and why it's valid as an art piece. And then I want you to post that onto the discussion board. And I think I also want people to write about 3 other images that they see, because I want people to kind of interact with this a little bit. And I think the most important thing when you do your response, the 2 most important things are refer to the artistic critique tools, like I say in the description, but also be positive. I told you guys about one of the most successful conceptual art pieces that anybody did in this class, didn't I? Did I tell you about that? It was done by a woman that absolutely hated conceptual art. She thought it was a massive waste of time. And she's the one that got random titles and then spent like $10 buying random stuff at a DI and put together an art show with the random objects with titles that she drew out of a hat, just to see how people would react. But it tied so beautifully into what Marcel Duchamp was addressing, because people thought it was an art exhibit because she presented it as an art exhibit. And I just think that that's absolutely fascinating. Now so that's that part of the assignment. The second part of the assignment is wrapping. And when you guys do your background research and write a little bit, there are several different artists to look at that each approach this idea a little bit differently. One of my favorites of those is a woman who was actually, her family committed her to an institution because they thought that she was not developed enough to operate in regular society or to operate alongside other people. And what was so sad about that is she actually was deaf, and none of the doctors or anybody that looked at her, caught on to that fact. And so they just thought she was, damaged goods. Her name was Judith Scott. The happiest moment of her life, Judith Scott's life, was when her sister found her. After her parents died, her sister found her where she had been lost in the state system and rescued her and got her into a group home where she could interact with other people and actually work with the broader world. And that's when she started doing her art. And I think that story is a little bit heartrending. But the fact that Judith Scott was able to reunite with her sister, and she was so overjoyed and started spontaneously creating this incredibly heartfelt art with this idea of rapping, I think is really a beautiful story. But one of the other artists that we talk about is an artist duo called Jean-Claude and Christo. And I'm going to share my screen with them really quick. These guys, as soon as you start seeing their work, you'll know exactly who they are. Okay, do you see this? These images? This is the Reichstag wrapped in plastic, the Arc de Triomphe wrapped in plastic, the Central Park gates. Jean-Claude and Christo are the dynamic duo that would use plastic to wrap things with. A lot of people, my grandpa included, thought that this was a huge waste of time. And it was kind of interesting to me because there are a number of things that there are a number of concepts and conceptual ideas that they're working with using plastic. And as we look at these different objects that they've done, like here they've wrapped an island with plastic. Here they wrapped a coastline with plastic. These buildings are wrapped with plastic. These trees are wrapped with plastic. Remember last week I talked about some of the models, live models that Jean-Claude and Christo would wrap with plastic. You can go to their website, and I think the website is still being kept up. They passed away a short while ago. But what is really fascinating about their work is, well, I'll ask you, what do you think is really interesting about their work? Do you think it's a waste of time first?
Say no. It kind of like frames the object in like a new light, new perspective.
Yeah, one of the things we talked about last week was the monkey mind. We're insatiably curious. When you see something wrapped like this, what is your first instinct?
See what's underneath.
Yeah, exactly. If you saw 5 boxes from U-Haul in front of you, and one of the 5 boxes was wrapped with pink paper, which would be the first one you'd want to go and look at?
The pink one.
Yeah, I would think so. And what they're doing, I think, is really interesting. Like when they did the Arc de Triomphe, when you look at their conceptual drawings for this to show people to start raising the money for it, you can see how they painted where the ropes would be, where the knots would be, how they tie it. And so they were really concerned with the visual presentation as well. And then you see the actual thing, it falls pretty closely to their drawings. They're the same thing with cars and things like that. And there's some other things. I mean, curiosity is one. Another one is preservation. like here, these wrapped trees, they did lots of things with wrapped trees. And some of the things that we can talk about with that are maybe the wrapped trees have an environmentalist issue going on, that they want to preserve trees. But the problem is, if you wrap any living thing with plastic, what's going to happen? What's going to start happening almost immediately?
It'll die.
Yeah. So they're forcing you to ask questions about, well, how far do you go to preserve until that preservation process itself contributes to the destruction? You know, and so that's a good set of questions to have. And then you look at the Reichstag, this black and white one on the left. A lot of people feel that their government, the Reichstag, is the symbol of government in Germany. They feel that their government disempowers common people and is completely separate, is completely unattached from regular folks. So that government is separate from the governed. And maybe this talks about that. Maybe it's also talking about people seeking to preserve history. Maybe that's why it's wrapped in plastic. So they try to preserve history to the point where they are destroying or suffocating the very thing that they're trying to protect and preserving the history. Some other things are really interesting as they use the plastic. This, I cannot remember the name of this one. This, can you see where my mouse is? It's an image of all these white, basically fences that were made. Jean-Claude and Christo, what they did was they started at a point near the California coastline and set a number for how many miles they would do it. And they started asking people if they could go through their property to set up this gate for this installation. Several people said no. Some people said you can only go here. Some people said we don't want it anywhere near us. So what started conceptually as a straight line leading right towards the California coast became very quickly this incredible snake with, you know, lots of curlicues, lots of really odd shapes. None of it was designed beforehand by Jean-Claude and Christo. It was all designed or happened spontaneously by how people felt about their property and other people's access to their property. So it became this opaque fence that became a symbol of how Americans view property and land ownership. Isn't that interesting? Just because of that. And we can see other things that they've done too. One of my favorites is this one right here, the pink one. This was actually done in Florida, in a community that was suffocating because of economic downturns. And a lot of people, I don't know if you guys know, what is the single greatest danger to the manatee, which is a protected species in Florida? Do you guys know what the single biggest danger to them is?
Is it boats?
Yeah, exactly. It's thoughtless tourists using illegal propellers and doing indiscriminate tourism in Florida waters. And so what this community did is say, well, we want the public attention that Jean-Claude and Christo can give us. So they went and asked Jean-Claude and Christo to design something. This community was able to get people interested enough that they started contributing funds to make this thing, which is several islands that are essentially wrapped with these just this flat pink plastic around it. And what was so fascinating about it to me is that there were three things it did. One was completely revitalized the entire community in Florida, economically and in most every other way. People actually enjoyed this because the people in that community that invited them were the ones that were employed to put it up. The second thing it did was bring attention to tourism in Florida, both for people to come and enjoy the beautiful area, and also for people to be aware of the damage it was causing. And the third thing it did was really bring to the fore the ideas of how much you have to actually care when there's a protected species. You know, stop being thoughtless. Don't litter indiscriminately, and take care of this protected species. What was fascinating to me is knowing that those three things happened. I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember the national outcry when this project was unveiled. Do you guys remember any of it? Or are you guys familiar with it at all?
I'm not.
No.
Well, what had happened was Jean-Claude and Christo, a lot of people, lawsuits started being brought up because they said that Jean-Claude and Christo were indiscriminately damaging and threatening the Floridian wildlife and landscape, their biosphere. They were shutting down a community, you know, putting up this art project, and they were endangering wildlife, which is funny that those lawsuits would be brought against them, because those were the three things that they actually did that were positive. So I thought that was, I don't know, ironic is a word that just means a little too little in this case. But I get kind of excited about these guys because in this simple process of wrapping, there are so many different layers of meaning that we can use, that we can work with, that we can communicate and make people think about. From the objects that we select to wrap, to the materials that we're using to wrap with, to how we apply those materials to the objects that we're wrapping, how we present it, all of those kinds of things. To really consider the objects that you're using to wrap, the materials that you're wrapping with, how you're going to apply that wrapping, and be able to articulate what you're accomplishing or what you intend to accomplish with the wrapping process. Thinking about all those things that are that you're engaging as you do it. Do you guys have any questions about the stuff that we've talked about today?
I don't think I have any.
How about you, Tanner?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. I am going to share one more screen, and this is the assignment screen. All right. Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Yeah.
What do you think these objects were originally? What do they look like they were?
Just like sticks.
Yeah, exactly. They're just random sticks. And he's using several different materials to wrap these. The one on the left, I believe he's using a blue plastic with like an orange yarn. The one in the middle, he's using shredded paper as one of the things. There's another one is masking tape, I believe. And then there's just very different materials here. And then the one on the right, he's doing the same kind of thing, and he's incorporated this globular structure on top that is actually white plastic wrapped around a big ball of masking tape. And just doing the process of wrapping it, he's really changed the form itself, hasn't he? These are no longer just random sticks. The one on the left looks like some weird insect almost. And then the one in the middle and the one on the right, they become almost figural. They almost look like they're riffs on like a person or a human form. And so we don't have to just wrap something like you would a present. We can change the form itself as well. And I included 4 examples here. We have, and these are all from students of my classes in previous semesters. One on the top left they used basically is random material to wrap with, but it follows a very strong color palette, doesn't it? You have primary colors there. The one right next to it started out. What do you think that the original object was that they started with?
You say the image in the bottom left?
No, the top right.
Top right. Totally opposite of what I was thinking. It looks like a stuffed animal.
Yeah, it looks like a Build-A-Bear or a Cabbage Patch Kid or one of those atrocities. But
Yeah.
I'm sorry, damaged childhood. But it's completely transformed because of all the different kinds of materials that were used to wrap it with. And we look at the two on the bottom. One is an overall view, and the one to the right of it is a close-up of the same thing. What is the original object, or what are the original two objects?
Ironing board and an iron.
Yeah, yeah. And what was the material that they used to wrap it with?
That just looks like cling wrap.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what it is. It's just saran wrap, cling wrap, that kind of a thing. But instead of just one thing that I want people to look at with these 4 images is that the artists didn't just drape stuff over, and they didn't do it just haphazardly. It was very intentional. Like even with just the one material, the cling wrap, you can see in the bottom left image, they put little trinkets in the cling wrap as they were wrapping the ironing board. And they didn't stop with just a loop or two. They wrapped the whole thing, and they wrapped it with several layers. And you can see it looks to me like that iron is not going to go anywhere. It looks like it's pretty securely adhered to the ironing board with all that cling wrap they used. And when somebody does something like that, there's a couple different thoughts to think of doing it. Were you aware that when mummies were wrapped in the ancient Egyptian tradition, as they were being wrapped, people would put little talismans and trinkets. Well, they weren't really trinkets. They were little spells, little notes, things like that, in with the wrappings as they were wrapping it up. Just like this person has put different things in the cling wrap on the ironing board. And they didn't just do that for aesthetic effect. They knew about the Egyptian mummy wrapping tradition, and they were very conscious of that as they were building this object. I think that whether or not other people can articulate your exact frame of mind or frame of reference, intent, or purpose as you are building your art, whether or not other people can articulate that the same way you are is a lot less important than when you work with intent. People who view it can always tell that you've worked with intent. And they are going to take what you do more seriously as a result of that. So even though this may not have taken an awful lot of time, we can tell that it was made with intent, can't we? Looking at those two bottom images, what are some of the things that you think about that we're going to skip through the first two tools of artistic critique and go right to the third one? What are some interpretations you can have knowing that this is designed to be a conceptual piece? And if you guys can each just say one or two things, that'd be great. What are the kinds of things that you think about and think that maybe this artist is addressing?
It kind of feels like something like you do before you like put it away for a while, so you could see it as like not being so concerned with how like each crease on your shirt looks or something. I don't know, just kind of like letting go, maybe.
Okay, I think that's an excellent observation. How about you, Kylie?
This is for the ironing board piece.
Yes, right.
So one thing that it kind of made me think of is it's one of those chores that like never goes away, right?
Right.
And when you have a lot of those chores, it kind of builds up, and I think it feels kind of binding sometimes, kind of like you're stuck. So it's kind of what it makes me think of.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good concept too. I mean, but neither of you said the same thing, but both of you guys are able to articulate it, and both views are perfectly valid. And I think the artist is addressing multiple ideas. I think they may very well have addressed both of those ideas in building this. So it doesn't have to be just one thing. I never got a photo of this, but I'll tell you my favorite one of all time was somebody took a Build-A-Bear, and this person dealt with a lot of just dealing with emotional irregularity and stress as part of college life. But what this person did is they took all the stuffing out of the Build-A-Bear, put a wire armature in it that you could actually bend and flex, put the stuffing back in, and then wrap the whole thing really tightly with electrical tape. So it looked like the Build-A-Bear was wearing a latex suit, and then wrapped it with barbed wire. And he took photos of this Build-A-Bear wrapped in this latex suit and barbed wire, just walking along happily down the street, doing different things like that. And it was making this toy do cute things that you would see in a Care Bear cartoon as this very, I guess we shall say, unapproachable Gothic take on the common toy. But I thought that was fascinating, because just using electrical tape, he completely transformed the entire meaning of something that has a really strong history, specifically here in Utah as well. Build-A-Bear have been very popular here in Utah, and I thought that was fascinating. So that's, these things we're all talking about, the assignments for this week's module. I'd like to get kind of just a last take from both of you on what conceptual art is. If you can, we've talked about that a little bit. Can you, both of you, kind of encapsulate a little bit about what conceptual art is, and whether or not you think it has validity? Whether or not you do, I don't really care, but I want to hear if you don't think it does. And actually, no, I'm not going to say this differently. I would like one of you to say, yes, I think it's valid, and explain why. And the other one, the second person, say, no, I think it's a waste of time, and explain why. And then, that'll be just fine, but go ahead and do the assignment anyway. So who wants to explain conceptual art and say why it's valid, and who wants to say why it's not valid?
We'll do whatever Tanner doesn't.
Okay.
Oh, I'll take the easy one and say why it is then.
Okay.
It kind of just feels like an expression of self, where it's like, it kind of feels like it's more important of the intentions of the artist while making the piece, rather than like the piece itself. So you kind of have to like, the piece is very much tied to the artist. And I think that's kind of like what art is just kind of like expressing yourself in that kind of way.
I think that's a really good observation, and I think the big difference between like doing a painting yourself and doing conceptual art is that with a painting, a lot of your energy is expressed just in the part of building the painting. And in conceptual art, maybe you don't have to express that much extra energy, and you can focus that energy on the intent, maybe. How about you, Kylie? Why is conceptual art an absolute waste of time?
Why is it an absolute waste of time? I think one of the ways it can be an absolute waste of time is because sometimes I think it feels inaccessible. I think that sometimes we as artists have big ideas and we want to communicate them, and kind of in our thought process, what we get to makes sense. And it maybe makes sense to people with a similar background. But I think that sometimes that's lost in the communication, that somebody with a different background approaching it does not even get the same thing and it looks like a pile of junk.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really, really good observation too. What can we do to help make it accessible?
I think one of the things that we can do, I think symbols are really helpful. Like the student you described, we are familiar with like a stuffed teddy bear, right? And what that represents generally. Um, the fact that he used black electrical tape and something to bind it. Black has a lot of symbolism. Um, and especially when that's juxtaposed with the bear and then the environment that doesn't seem so solemn like the bear situation is, um I think that feels pretty accessible. So yeah, I think symbols help.
You can communicate a lot through symbols, and they don't have to be, the stereotypical symbols that we see on road signs or stuff like that, but just like one of the symbols you mentioned was just the environments that the bear was in. That the process of the bear being an active toy is a sort of symbol. I think that's really good. Being mindful of those kinds of things really helps. But I'm thinking another one might be being really aware of who our audience is, because as we're producing something that's intensely personal, like Tanner's talking about, being aware of the audience that we're fitting it into, it's going to make a lot more sense when we make use of symbols that they're familiar with, like what Kylie's saying. And I think being aware of both of those things is going to make your conceptual work uh, a, a lot more shareable, I think. And one of the most important aspects of art, I think, is that it completes a circuit of communication on some level. And when we make it accessible, I think it really helps to complete the work. So those are excellent, both of you guys, excellent observations. Very nice. So think about these things as you're doing this. And one more time, who is the fairy godfather of conceptualism?
It's the fountain guy. I've just forgotten his name.
Yep, Marcel Duchamp. Excellent, very good. Whenever you produce something that I think that you're producing with, where you have specific intent to produce it, I think the conceptual aspect of that artwork is a lot easier for other people to read. And whether or not you're producing stuff that is intended to be purely conceptual, being aware of how you are sharing the intent that you're using as you build can really inform what you do. And so that's one of the reasons why I get really excited about this part of it. It deals with 3D design, not necessarily because it's three-dimensional, but because it gives us another tool, another piece of equipment in our toolbox to help communicate more clearly as we're working with our art. But I really appreciate you guys' comments. That's been absolutely great. This is so much less boring than when nobody shows up and I'm by myself. It gets so. My wife can always tell in the other room, "Oh, you were by yourself tonight, weren't you?" Because there's absolutely no energy. It gets very dry. So thank you very much for participating and helping me cover these things. Do you guys have any last questions, or do you have any ideas that are potential questions that other people might have in the class that weren't able to make it tonight?
I have one.
Okay.
So with the final next week, it's available Monday. is it due? When does the semester end? I guess this is something I could look up too. But like, when is it officially due? Is it Friday? Do we have through the weekend?
It's due Friday at midnight.
Okay.
Okay, and we do have a meeting next Tuesday as well during that last week, and that time we'll talk about final questions that anybody has, and I'm hoping that as many people as possible will show up for that to ask questions. But yeah, the final is due is available for 120 hours for everybody to work on from midnight to midnight, Monday through Friday. And so I guess Sunday at midnight, 12:01 Monday morning, something like that, all the way to 12:50 or 11:59 Friday night. So that whole time. If you guys do need extra time to work on stuff, and this is for everybody in the class, contact me and let me know, because there are things that I can do, especially in conjunction with the Office of Accommodations on campus, to help you to get the grade that you need, to get the grade that you deserve. One thing that I have seen time and time again is that students at UVU are not lazy. You're not thoughtless. You do the work, but one of the things that holds people up is emergencies, and another one is not getting stuff turned in. So be very mindful. If you have emergencies, let me know, and make sure that you turn in everything that you can, and just let me know what's going on if it happens to be late. All right. So everybody who's turned stuff in late, they've told me why, and it's been something that we can work out. So keep it up. How about you, Tanner? Any questions yourself? Thank you, Kylie. Tanner, any questions yourself, or any questions that you think somebody else in the class might have? This is really disturbing. I put my hand above my shoulder and all of a sudden it disappears. That is just odd. Anyway, I'm sorry, Tanner, what?
Oh, I was going to say you answered it. I was just going to ask if we still had a meeting next week.
Yeah, we will. We'll have a meeting on Tuesday, and it will be kind of a last chance for everybody to ask questions and stuff and go over last thoughts.
Perfect.
So and that day also, I'll ask questions. I'll answer questions about the final, and we'll talk about that more. All right. All right. Excellent. Well, as soon as we're off, I will start the 4-hour process of uploading this video onto our YouTube channel. Has that been helpful to you guys to have that YouTube channel?
I haven't used it. Hate to say
Okay,
it. Sorry.
Well, you haven't really had to, because you've been present at the meetings, haven't you?
Yeah.
So that's good. All right, guys. I hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful week and weekend as we move into this final week. And I have every confidence that you guys are going to do absolutely stellar things applying texture and color to your sculpture. And again, this is not any random sculpture. It is a piece that you carved out of foam and then covered with paper mache. It's that particular piece, and you're adding color and texture out the wazoo to it. And when you think you're done, turn around, readdress it, and add more. So, do it until there's no room to do it anymore. All right? Hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful week, and I will see you on Tuesday. All righty?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.